You're listening to Psych with Mike, and the most important way to support the show is to find us on YouTube and hit that subscribe button. So no matter how you listen to Psych with Mike, find us on YouTube, smash the subscribe button, and we really appreciate it. Now, here's Psych with Mike. Welcome into the Psych with Mike and Brett Library. This is Dr. Michael Mahan.
And I am Brett Newcomb.
Do you like your family?
Most of them.
Are there any of them that you struggle with?
As in currently?
Or historically?
There have been.
Yeah. Do you think that there is any person who hasn't dealt with some form of estrangement in their family?
No.
Yeah, and I am want to speak in absolutes, as you know, and so I would say no, although I'm willing to accept that there's been a single individual somewhere in history. I had a student once who...
A single individual, meaning no family?
Well, maybe.
And they weren't struggling.
Yeah, because they weren't struggling. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. But I did have a student once who, and I teach, one of the classes that I teach is the psychology of adolescence. And so I was talking about how adolescence is this time of tumult traditionally in society. And she said, oh, my adolescence was perfect. I got along great with my family and still do. And I was like, I don't know that that's true. And was thinking, oh, maybe she's like repressing something.
What's her name, Pollyanna?
It was Polly, but not Anna.
Polyamorous.
But the more that I started thinking about it, the more I thought, well, why can't there be somebody who has a perfectly peaceful and serene adolescence? Absolutely, that can happen. But this idea of estrangement is something that people struggle with. We have talked about it on the show before. I'm sure we will talk about it again. What I wanted to try and focus on today was how do we encourage clients to experience this estrangement in their family and either deal with that with aplomb or find ways of being able to accept it. I think that sometimes the acceptance is really hard.
Yeah, I would think so, in my experience.
Yeah.
It's a true statement. You know, so often when people come in and they are having relationship issues with anybody, they want to spend their time talking about the other person and the way the other person behaves or doesn't behave. Why do they do this? Why don't they do that? How come this happens? How come they are that way? And it's a very seductive set of arguments because together you and I can sit and talk about Joe for as long as we want to. Nothing changes. Nothing will be any different. We might feel better because we've talked about it, but it doesn't change the reality. And the challenge for the therapist is to get the strength and the perspective to say, well, that's really interesting, Mike, but Joe's not here. Let's talk about Mike. What does Mike do when this happens? What does Mike feel when this happens? What does Mike think when this happens? And how does he process that and handle it? What choices does he make? What choices does he have? So I want to talk about you because you're in the room. Now, if Joe comes in the room with you, we can have a conversation that includes him. But if he's not here, you are. So my job at that point is to talk to you about you, not about them. So if you come in and say, I'm estranged from my family, my son doesn't like me, my grandfather hates me, my mother disinherited me, woe is me. I'm talking about how that feels. It sucks, feels bad, you feel misunderstood, you feel outraged, you feel violated, you feel whatever. Tell me how you feel. Let's process that. Then, what can you do about it?
Right. And you have obviously had clients that were working on issues of estrangement. I've had tons of clients that have been working on this issue. And I think you're so right that it is difficult to say to that person, we need to focus on you because they're so focused on these external things.
Why does my mother say these things to me?
It's not my fault. I didn't do anything. And this person, and you can say, okay, you're right. It's not your fault. But that doesn't change the reality that this is what is happening in your world, and we need to
Well, how
try and.
useful is it to assign fault anyway?
Well, it's not. Well, I mean, we all know that, but
Well, no, we
we
don't
all
all
do
know
it. Well,
that.
as therapists, we all accept that as a given. Hopefully, there are no therapists who think that they should assign blame because that's not our job. So we shouldn't be assigning blame. But realistically, when you're talking to another human being in the room, it's hard not to feel that kind of compassion because a lot of times estrangement happens in ways that are not explainable. There are no set of like when we talk about a lot of estrangement comes, we've talked about this before, in situations of abuse. In situations of abuse, it's very easy to say to that client, it's not your fault. You had nothing to do with it. You were an unwitting victim, and yet we still need to talk about taking care of you. If all of a sudden, a child or a parent says out of the blue, I'm no longer going to have a relationship with you, it's harder to square that circle.
Because there's such a need to assign blame
Yeah.
and fault, and to suppress the rage that you feel, the sense of violation. Those can contaminate you if you don't find a healthy way to process them. But reality is reality, and you have to deal with reality. So if your father disinherited you and then gave all of his money when he died to some dog, set up a estate for my dog that loved me and not my son, you're violated and you're angry and you can't change it because he's dead and gone. I mean, I have had therapy sessions with people that were trying to have conversations with their dead father. If you could tell him and he would understand, if he would hear and see and know, what do you want him to know? What do you want to say to him? And they'll cry and they'll say, it hurts, and why didn't you love me, and I hate you. And so at the end of the day, does that help them?
Well, it's
might.
cathartic.
It might
Sure,
help
sure,
some.
sure.
But the challenge then becomes,
But what are you going to do when that session's over? Because you still have to go out into the world and live with it.
well, but that's true of any individual session. If
Yeah.
you take it in isolation, when they leave the room, so what? But over time, you can help them find ways to be stronger. You can help them find ways to process contaminated realities and to give both permission and forgiveness.
Right.
So that it's not raw all the time. It may never go away, but it can stop suppurating.
Right.
It can stop leaking and draining. It can scab over. Although an awful lot of people pull the scabs off just constantly. And so then you point that out to them. There's a pattern in your life of constantly ripping the scabs off of old wounds and re-experiencing them that is counterproductive for you. It's not helpful to you. It causes you pain and it keeps you in a stuck place. If you really want to get past it,
Right.
you have to quit pulling the scabs off.
Right.
Of it.
And
Well, but I don't understand.
all of us, I think, if we've been doing therapy for any substantial period of time, have had an experience where we've done exactly this. We've been working with someone who's experienced loss or estrangement, and you do the thing. You say, okay, write a letter and then bring it to me and share it with me when you feel comfortable. We can burn it or do some other ritualized way of symbolizing letting it go. But then the person says at the end of that, sometimes they say, "Oh my gosh, I feel so light. It just feels like an elephant has been lifted off of my chest." But then sometimes they say, okay, well, now what? And that's the question is, now what? Now what do we do? And you're answering that. We need to find ways of helping you find a path forward that is more functional for you. And a lot of times that involves forgiveness. Forgiveness of the other person, number one, but a lot of times forgiveness of the self, which can oftentimes be much more difficult.
I think it's incredibly more difficult. Partly because I think you've been indoctrinated or trained to blame yourself, to be guilty, to be shame-based. In our culture, that's a way we parent. But also, there's incredible persistent belief that I could have made a difference if I
Right.
just had a chance. I could have made them see or understand if I just had a chance. And now that they're dead and gone, well, I don't have a chance anymore, so now what? And so then my question becomes, what's the advantage in keeping that wound open? And, theoretically, when you go back to the training and psychology and personality theory and all that kind of stuff, there's something called the death of the object. And many of the more prevalent theorists that you and I have studied, and probably other therapists as well, will say that someone who's trapped in a struggle with the object, and the object typically is understood to be the mother, but it could be any significant parental influence. So if I'm trapped in a struggle with the object where they didn't understand me, I didn't understand them, there was a lot of pain involved, and stuff I can't get away from, I just can't put it down, I can't change my life as long as they're alive. The theory is that once the object dies, mother finally dies, then, and only then, you can come to grips with changes that you can make. Because there's no feedback loop from her that continues to put energy into the system. I've seen a lot of people struggle with that, and I've seen some miraculous turnarounds when somebody finally dies. Challenge for me is working with somebody whose object hasn't died to say, can we make your life better if we can find a way for you to let go of her as if she were dead? Can you give yourself the power and the right and the freedom to say, I'm going to disengage from this because it's poisonous and dysfunctional to me. It costs me more than it pays me in benefits to have this flutter continue.
Right.
So can I separate myself from this family member in ways that are healthy for me and leave the conflict unresolved, but push it away?
And I've actually seen that exact dynamic play out in therapy, where the object passes away, and for whatever reason, that gives the individual permission or ability to be able to let go. But I've also worked with a lot of people where the object is still present, and I still want to try and help them. And there are two things that you have talked about extensively that have really helped me in that. One is you talk about emotional economics. How much is this paying you? How much is this costing you? And I think that that is a really great way to help individuals to be able to make that cost-benefit analysis in a way that is less emotionally involved. And I think that can be really, really helpful, and I use that a lot. But another thing that you said when we were graduate students, this was an example that you talked about, that you have talked about over and over again throughout the course of time that I've known you, that has really been beneficial for me. I don't know if it helps clients, but it really helped me to conceptualize this. And you talked about it's like garbage. And if you have a big pail of garbage out in your garage and you need to get rid of the garbage, but instead of it, you have this emotional attachment to the garbage. And if you dump it out on the floor of the garage and then you roll around in it and you rub it on yourself and you keep it close to you, then you're not moving on. You're just remaining stuck with a bunch of garbage, and now you stink because you've been rolling in the garbage. And what we need to try and do is to find ways of helping you conceptualize being able to take the garbage out to the curb and let the trash man pick it up and take it away. And that has always really helped me to be able to conceptualize what we're talking about when we're looking at these issues of estrangement.
Yeah. I don't remember using that particular analogy. The one that I always used was about dog poop. Dog poops in the yard and it stinks. If you leave it alone, it'll crust over and stop stinking. But if you kick it and knock the crust off of it, it'll smell again. There are people who regularly go out and kick the crust off of the dog poop in their life, whatever the source of that may be, and say, yeah, it still stinks.
Right.
Why? And it's terrible. It's terrible. It's awful. Why,
Right.
why does this keep happening? I said, well, because you keep kicking it.
Right.
If you get rid of it and don't kick it anymore, You won't smell it anymore.
And I think that some therapists, especially when you first start out, that may feel mean, right? Because it's like blaming the victim, like, oh, I'm saying something harsh to the person that I perceive to be
I
the
would
victim.
suggest it's blaming the perpetrator. You're doing it yourself.
Well, yeah, okay, well, yeah. So in that way, you're the perpetrator because
Yeah.
no, and I agree with that. But I think that it's difficult for some people, especially when they're new in the profession, to be able to understand that and to be
I
able
remember
to.
I worked with a psychologist named Sue Harbath years back. And Sue was talking about this man that she was seeing who was really resistant to hearing what he was saying about the struggles in his life. And he was the classic help rejecting complainer. No matter what. And Sue, sweet woman, smart woman, but nice person, wanted to be a nice person.
And you were doing supervision.
Whatever.
No. I think I was in this meeting when you. Okay, go ahead.
Anyway, Sue said, I don't know what to do. And we were discussing it, and I said, tell him that you need to plan a hospitalization because he's going to completely collapse. The system is not going to support him. It's not going to sustain him. The way he's functioning is going to lead to a heart attack or a health issue, and he's going to be in the hospital. So let's plan it. When do you want this to happen? You want it to happen in February? You want it to happen in March? Which is a better time for you? Which can you afford better and with work, what have you? And he was really shocked. He was like, why are you saying this to me? She said, because this is where you're going. You're on this road. You're determined to stay on this road until something extreme happens. Then maybe there'll be a chance to get off. But until it does, we're just spinning our wheels here, and I don't want to play. So let's plan a date for you to be in the hospital and have this crisis. And we all started laughing because it made such perfect sense in the discussion. But had any of us thought of saying that to the client?
Right.
And would we?
Because it feels harsh.
Yeah.
But it's not. It's a way of sometimes you have to say things that may feel harsh in the moment.
But it's simple. If the client says, I can't carry this anymore. It's so heavy. And you say, well, put it down.
Right.
And they look at you and they, I'm paying you for that? Yes.
When I was working in the treatment center at Highland Center, and there was a guy there named Mike Powers, who some people may remember Mike Powers. He was a big guy in the recovery profession in St. Louis at one period of time. But he would always tell this story of this guy had a headache. And what was happening was that he had a hammer, and he was just kept hitting himself in the head with the hammer, and he was complaining about this headache. He went to the doctor, and he said, "Doctor, man, I got these splitting headaches. They just won't go away." And the doctor said, "Well, quit hitting yourself in the head with the hammer." And the guy was like, "Oh, yeah." I mean, sometimes when people can see it from that perspective, then they're like, "Oh, I'm doing this to myself. I can choose to stop." So a lot of the pain.
So what you're saying is the therapist doesn't climb in the boat with you and say, yeah, it looks bad from here. The therapist stands on the shore and says, well, come join me over here and look at it.
Right. And I think that maybe the therapist does climb in the boat with you initially and offer support and normalization. But at some point, if you're unwilling to stop your own self harm, then at some point the therapist has to call it out and say, you are hurting yourself. And when and if that individual can recognize that and say, oh, I am hurting myself and I can choose to stop, that can be therapeutically
So is it ever
powerful.
appropriate for the therapist to say to the client, I'm firing you
Well,
because you aren't going to
yeah,
do
that's
anything? We're stuck.
that is obviously a conundrum in psychology and therapy. And I've heard arguments on both sides. I've never fired anybody. I don't know if you have.
I don't think so.
I don't, yeah. I'd be surprised if you had, but I wouldn't, I mean, I'd be willing to hear that. I do believe that if you are absolutely convinced that you have no more therapeutic interventions that you can offer, and that you continuing with that client may actually be causing them harm,
You have an ethical obligation.
then you have an ethical obligation to do something
Send them
different.
somewhere else.
Right.
Yeah.
But short of that, I don't know what's to be gained in that. Although, again, I have heard arguments to the contrary where people say, hey, you know what? Once I feel like that this therapy has run its course, I'm responsible to say, I don't think there's anywhere else for us to go.
Yeah.
I feel like that there may be some catharsis, there may be some emotional release that the client may be experiencing that is helping them to be able to be functional more of the time when they're coming back to see you.
So you would say to a client, you're too enmeshed in a dysfunctional system, and I can't participate in that enmeshment any further. So I'm going to fire you, or I'm going to take a break. I want you to see somebody else for a while on other issues. Come back if you need to, and we'll have fresh eyes. But yeah, if that's truly where you are convinced that it is, you need to say, I'm not the right person. Of course, in my experience, people will more quickly say to you, you are not the right person. I'm going somewhere else.
Yeah. Yeah. I was going to say, I think that the profession tends to be one of self-selection. I mean, people, are going to either feel like that you're good for them or that you're not, and they're going to take their money and do what is right for them with it.
And if they're too invested in staying sick, they'll go somewhere where somebody will help them be sick.
Exactly.
And
That's right.
That way you can feel superior and smug.
But before we end, I want to ask you specifically about this idea of helping people forgive themselves. You agree that is the much harder aspect of, and a lot of times we talk about, forgiving yourself. People oftentimes are very, very reluctant. They have a lot of resistance built up about seeing themselves as a part of the problem because they view themselves as purely a victim. And if I say, well, you need to forgive you, then I'm saying you had some role in this, which we're not really saying. We're just saying you need to forgive yourself. How do you go about that? What do you do to help someone forgive themselves?
I ask them if they have a religious foundation that anchors them in life. And if the answer is yes, then I ask them what their faith teaches them about forgiveness, how it's acquired, how it's given, how it's experienced, how they can use it to heal themselves. And if it is not a foundation in their life, I tell them this is going to be a harder hill to climb. It can be done, and we can work on it. I'm willing to take the journey with you, but it's going to be a lot harder because you don't have that faith anchor that stabilizes you.
And for me, that's where the whole idea of the analogy for emotional economics comes in. If you say, okay, well, what is this costing you to hang on to it? And what could you gain by letting it go? Because really, to me, forgiveness is just letting something go, right? I mean, that's really by and large what it is.
I don't know. I'm open to that. I think we're saying the same thing. How can you put this load down that's blocking your ability to travel in the direction you want to go? Right. And perhaps you don't really want to go in that direction.
And that's the thing you got to evaluate, right?
Yeah.
And if you don't, why don't you?
Yeah.
Can we talk about that?
But you're trained, and I was trained. Don't ask the why question because they'll say, I don't know.
Yeah. You've got to ask open-ended questions. So I wonder what it is that you get out of this by not putting it down, for sure. So if you have issues of estrangement and you would like to share those with us, we would certainly be happy to hear those. You can get us at psychwithmike.com and send us an email. If you have questions or thoughts about a show or anything that you would like us to discuss, you can get us and send us an email through psychwithmike.com or go on the YouTubes, which is even better. Leave a comment, and no matter what, you should always go there and subscribe to the show because that really helps us out. The music that appears in Psych with Mike and Brett is written and performed by Mr. Benjamin DeClue. And as always, if it's Friday, it's Psych with Mike and Brett.